Hi, we enter into Genesis 27 today after two introductory videos, one to the entire story from 26:34 to 28:9, and one on Esau's women that frame the story, as we'll look at in a minute when we see the chiastic shape that fills the whole story. And we're only going to go through 4 verses today, this part, and if it seems like I'm going particularly slowly, even though I try to go slowly carefully throughout all the text we're looking at, this one in particular rewards a slow journey, because many scholars, as brilliant as they may be, seem to miss certain points and make assumptions that if we look more carefully, the text does not support. So I really encourage you to watch the introductory video to cover some of those. I'll touch on a couple of those briefly here, but there's more depth about that in the introductory video, as well as the importance of Esau's women as the framework for the story. So as we've been looking at throughout this unit here, we see that we're near the end of the section on Jacob and Esau here, matched by the returning section on Jacob and Esau here, and centered with the time with Jacob and Laban, which in my interpretation of the blessing story in 27 is what Rebekah's preparing Jacob for, is to send him back to her brother Laban, who's a known trickster. As we've been looking at the shape of it, so this is the chiastic shape, and if I zoom out like this, you can see the gray and the colors coordinating. But when we zoom up close, that's what's more important, is what we're going to see today. So we're looking not at that, but at the very beginning of it. Here's a long story indeed, just this blue part here, and the key words we'll hear are the here I am, back and forth, and we'll look why that's important in a minute. And then this phrase about hunting game, which is one word. It looks like a verb and a noun in English, but to hunt for game is the word. And we see that a number of times in this immediate section. We'll notice the key words largely are in each unit, although there are obviously some words that play all the way through, like blessing, both in the form of the verb and the form of the noun. So I put the form of the noun in this yellow color, and then the form of the verb in this color here in the blue. So you can see that's the verb form. But also, obviously, father and mother are key. And we'll see also son is key, and the back and forth between my son or your son or his son, his father, etc. So divide within the family is important up close. And then we'll also see, not this time, but next time, that what Isaac says to Esau here is very structurally parallel to what Rebekah will say to Jacob here. And we'll look at the comparisons of those next time. Another aspect we've been looking at in the larger picture is how this story can be read in parallel with these stories in 1 Kings, whether that's as an allegory or at least a correlation between these different characters. And this is posted at radicalbible.net, and I won't go over it in detail now, but again, I went over it in the introductory video. And similarly, I went over in detail all these questionable assumptions. And one of the ones that we really need to look at here is number 3, that the supposed rights of the firstborn, both the birthright that Jacob bought for the bowl of lentils back in chapter 25, and the paternal blessing here, are divinely sanctioned. And it's the assumption that they are, that the birthright was sanctioned, and that, as we heard, Esau despised the birthright, that leave many very reputable scholars, I'd suggest, to radically misread Esau. The fact that he despises the birthright, they think, says something bad about his character, as he's oafish, and the fact that he doesn't really understand what he's eating and talks in a quick way because he's so hungry from the field. Hey, he's not a sophisticated person, that he's kind of a boorish oaf. But despising the birthright may well be what the authors of Genesis do as well, which is to see the arbitrariness of a cultural custom that has no grounding, as far as we know, in Yahweh's will, that favors the firstborn, which is absurd in this context where they're twins. And so that's one of the issues we're going to look at. Another one is whether Isaac is a weak father. And I went over this sort of defense argument against the charge of Isaac's weakness in the introductory video. And again, I won't go over it again now, but these are the charges some scholars make about why he's weak, and my responses, as well as a number of examples that we've seen from earlier that suggest that Isaac is anything but weak, that he's successfully negotiated with kings and generals and other people for his own future and his people. So one more thing to look at before we jump right in, and I looked at this again in the introduction, but I just want to draw attention to it here, the parallels with earlier parts, both in the Abraham story here in chapter 12 and 22, in particular here, where we see my son and here I am in our verse right here in 27:1, and only otherwise in 22:7, as well as one more time in our verse. So something is being made parallel between the relation between Isaac and Esau and Abraham and Isaac, an earlier generation, and so that's what we'll look at as well. So let's have our key words up here as we jump right into our story. So I also will note that I have in my notes here a number of comments from scholars, and I posted a series of those in the introduction, so those are posted as well at Radical Bible. It's just some general comments from a range of scholars about what we're encountering in this story. And as we'll see, I've included in my notes, as I always try to do, views from people whose views I disagree with, but you get a chance to decide whose you think make more sense. So when Isaac was old and his eyes were dim so that he could not see. And we're already hearing something that's an interesting function of this story, which has a number of what people like Meyer Sternberg refer to as gaps, which is spaces in the narrative logic where we don't understand why people are doing things, or there's something left out that would be helpful to know. And there's always gaps in biblical storytelling. There's always gaps in all storytelling. We can't possibly tell all the details, and we have to decide just what kind of gaps we want to leave. But in addition to gaps, there's extra information a number of times here, and we'll see it even in our immediate situation more than once. So we're told Isaac was old, his eyes were dim so that he could not see. Let's look at some of the details. The word for dim literally means have faded away. It's only here in Genesis, although in 48:10 we'll be told that Jacob's eyes are old too, but it's a different word there. Contrasting with Moses in Deuteronomy, whose eyes are vigorous and strong to the end of his life. And we'll see that Leah's eyes are described not as dim, but in a way that's ambiguous, that we'll see later there. And scholars in the Midrash, including people like Rashi, want to give fanciful reasons why Isaac's eyes are dim. It's worth considering that for a moment, either because of the smoke of idolatry of his daughters-in-law, they're immediately dissing the Hittite daughters there, or because of the angelic tears of the Akedah falling into his eyes. And many Midrashic writers suggested that after almost being killed by his father, Isaac could not see. But this is many years later, and it's really suggesting in the text that his eyes are dim because of old age. But once we're told here that his eyes have faded away, we don't really need to hear also so that he could not see. That's a little extra piece, and we'll see more of that later, emphasizing that. And one of the interesting things about this scene is many scholars jump to the conclusion from Isaac was old and from what he says here, see, I am old, I do not know the day of my death, that this is a deathbed scene. And we can see it from art a number of ways that suggest that Isaac is old and frail and barely alive. But as we're going to see in a moment, that's not at all true, and we can know it's not true from the evidence of the text. So despite all the gaps and despite the amount of speculation that biblical scholars enter into to try to fill some of those gaps are made because we're just not reading carefully enough. So I want to show that in just a minute. So given this preface by the narrator that he's old and he can't see very well, he calls his elder son, as the New RSV has, or his great son, Bene Hagadal here, and we'll hear that again at verse 15. As the note here from Sarna has, the narrator studiously avoids calling Esau the firstborn because the term carries with it social and legal implications that he wished to avoid since Esau had sold his birthright. And that may well be, although Sarna is assuming that he can get into the minds of what the narrator's or the author's view is, that may be the case. It may be the case that the birthright is irrelevant. Isaac and Rebekah never mentioned it. Scholars speculate about whether they knew about it, whether either Jacob or Esau told their parents, but they never mentioned it. It's just irrelevant. As far as we know, the birthright was simply a private transaction between the two brothers. And so that's not what's at issue here. What's at issue here is the blessing. So he calls him and says, my son, and he answers, here I am, exactly like Isaac responding to his father in Genesis 22:7. And one might expect, therefore, the repeat of the call. And yet, as my note below says, just from my own thoughts, its parallel is clear by the difference. While Abraham was responding to God's call, whatever you might make of God's call to offer up your son, Isaac is responding simply to cultural practices. And I think that's exactly one of the points here. Because when this scene is over, Isaac and Esau, as far as we know, will never see each other again. In other words, they'll be as separated as a result of this as Isaac was from his father Abraham from the binding in chapter 22. But there it was because of at least an alleged, according to the Bible, the authors of Genesis, Yahweh's call. And here it's simply the cultural norm that's at issue. And I really want to highlight that because many scholars slip and assume that both the birthright and blessing have to do with fulfilling God's will. But there's nothing at all in the text that suggests that. So he says, see, or hinana, behold, please. And we'll see a number of beholds in the text. I didn't put that as a key word because it's not that many times, but I'll point them out when we do. So he says, "Behold, please, I am old." And notice he doesn't say he's dying. He says, "I do not know the day of my death." But guess what? I don't know the day of my death either, and you probably don't know the day of yours either. Very few people do. But here's the deal. According to, as you see in my note below, according to Genesis 35:28, and I don't need to go to those, it's just to see the number, Isaac will die when he's 180 years old. We know he was 40 when he married Rebekah, or was joined with Rebekah. And immediately after he's joined with Rebekah, he prays to God for her because of her barren womb, and she becomes pregnant and bears Jacob and Esau. And now Esau's 40. So depending upon how long we think it was between the time that Isaac and Rebekah got together and when she gave birth to these twins, is it a year, 5 years, 10 years? If it's 10 years even, then according to the chronology of the story, Isaac is 90 and still has 90 years left to live. And that's assuming a 10-year gap between when they got married and when that simple description of he prayed to God and God opened Rebekah's womb covered a 10-year gap. But almost no matter how wide we make it, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, he's still got many decades to live. So this is not at all a deathbed scene. He's simply taking care of something that he wants to take care of before he dies, whenever that is. And yes, he's old. He's 80-something, and clearly the book of Genesis has different understandings of how to measure people's ages, and I looked at that back in the primeval history unit, so we won't look at that right now. But by any measure, he's an older man with an adult son, but he's not on the point of death. So this is absolutely not a deathbed scene. It's just a scene of a father and a son with something important to take care of here. So, and what he says in verses 3 and 4 is astoundingly redundant. And it's a series of 5 imperative commands, and we don't hear a word about Esau's response. So we need to look at this very carefully to hear what's going on here. As my note below has, the hunting details underscore the contrast in Rebekah's version of Isaac's request, but we'll look at that when we get there. So he says, "Now then," Ve'atah, starting again exactly as Rebekah will do to Jacob. And I note 5 imperative verbs. And really, we know that Isaac loves Esau, that Esau is a hunter, and according to this and otherwise, we know that Isaac is very fond of the food that his hunter son can get him. So he could just say, "Go bring me some of the food that you hunt." And that would be enough. But instead, we get this elaborate description that certainly for Esau, he doesn't need to hear all this. So let's look at all the details. "Take your weapons," or halaika, literally as things elsewhere. And I note below here that the 3 immediate words in a row, weapons, quiver, and bow, form a rhyme, as you can hear with the ika suffix at the end of each one there. It's not really a suffix, but ending there because of the grammar. So take your things, your quiver and your bow. Obviously, Esau's a hunter. He does not need to be told to take what weapons he is. And talika, as for quiver, only here in the Hebrew Bible. The word for bow is also the word for bowman. So it's the same word for the bow itself and for the one who exercises it. So you don't need to tell him to take his quiver and his bow, and he also doesn't need to be told to go out in the field. The bow here links with Ishmael, though, who's a bowman, and of course, I shouldn't say of course, but if you watch the last video, and you can see here on my keywords chart that Esau will go back to Ishmael to get his 3rd woman, that in addition to the 2 Hittite women up here. So the reference to the bow connects him with the Ishmael people. The issue of hunting connects him with Nimrod, and many scholars see that as negative, and certainly in the primeval history, Nimrod was meant to see as negative because he was the first empire builder, but we know nothing about Esau building any empire, certainly not in this story. Edom was a fellow nation to Israel, but Edom was not like Assyria or Babylon or later Rome, who the Midrash in the Common Era takes as the embodiment of Esau/Edom. So he's not really connected with Nimrod in that kind of way. So his father told him, take all these things and go out in the field. In the Midrash, it's an allusion to Edom and Edom's dominance of Israel in later times. And that's part of the reason I'm not going to look at the Midrash for this passage, because the stuff about Edom is really about issues that the rabbis are dealing with where there are Christians as Edom, Christian Romans, and that's very different than our situation here. And again, he doesn't need him to tell him where to go, and he doesn't need him to tell him to hunt game. If he just told him to take your quiver and bow and go out in the field, what else would he be doing out there? And the whole phrase here is literally hunt for hunting provisions. Saidah here for provisions, and sayed for the verb for to hunt game. And as my note has, in terms of directions, this last is all that is needed to say to Esau. If he just said, go hunt game for me. And he doesn't need to say anything in verse 4 here. Consider it both directions. He could just say, bring me the food that I like, which implies you have to hunt it and get it and prepare it. Or he could say, just hunt the food for me, which obviously implies that he has to prepare it or give it to mom to prepare and bring it, because what good would just be a dead carcass out there? So the hunt implies the preparation, the bringing, and the bringing and the preparation imply the previous hunt, and yet we hear all these details, slowing it all down to focus on what Isaac is saying to Esau. And I would suggest as readers to get us to slow down and focus on exactly what's being said, as some readers don't seem to do as well as others. So again in verse 4, now prepare me savory food. We have to look at a couple of the key words here. Prepare literally is make, expecting Esau to do it himself, which is to say a woman's task, although we saw Jacob making the lentil stew, Jacob being the mama's boy in the tent, so it's not surprising that he has cooking skills, but certainly a person who's a hunter has to have the skills to turn his dead animal into food. So that would not be surprising that he has those skills and that his father knows it. So prepare for me, and the New RSV continuously uses this term savory food, and I translate it that way. It's 6 times in this scene, mat'amim here, and not elsewhere in Genesis. It's sometimes, as in Proverbs, translated as delicacies, though. And that's an interesting element, because one would not normally think of as a hunk of animal meat, no matter what animal one might have out there, a deer as likely as anything else, to be a delicacy. It's just what they eat. It's not like the alternative is get me something from the store. The only alternative, as Rebecca will say, is to get me something from the flock. So maybe it's more of a delicacy because it's wild, but hunting wild animals in this context is also not something unusual. There's no suggestion that if you're lucky and you can find an animal, it just assumes you can go out there and get one, because there were way more animals than there were people, unlike the situation that we live in now in the 21st century. So prepare that for me. And as White suggests, and I really want to look at this more closely, he says, the savory dish is thus the quintessence of the hunt and the embodiment of the materialist, violent, desire-driven mentality that goes with it. What sexual lust is to Pharaoh in Genesis 12, the taste of the hunt is to Isaac. And I just want to say, wow! Now, I don't happen to be a meat eater myself, but would White be saying that everybody who goes to Mickey D's for a burger is the embodiment of the materialist, violent, desire-driven mentality that goes with it? Maybe at some deep level, but plainly that would make Esau just an ordinary person who likes his burgers or his steaks, like so many millions of others around the world. So there's nothing special about that. And to highlight it in this materialist, violent way, in implicit contrast with a spiritual, non-violent way, is really to take Esau despising his birthright as a clue for saying everything we're going to read about Esau we need to interpret negatively, or about Isaac, which is the case here. This is about the taste of the hunt to Isaac. And even actually in the Pharaoh situation, we didn't know that Pharaoh had any sexual lust. He didn't touch Sarah. He took her in, but it wasn't necessarily a matter of lust. It may have been a matter of having a royal harem for the sake of honor, and for what kings do, they take women. So both the assumptions, I think, ought to be challenged there, but the more relevant one is the issue here. So prepare for me this kind of food, such as I like, and curiously, New RSV translates this explicit word in Hebrew that means love as like. And that's really wrong at a couple of levels, because part of the point is that we heard that Isaac loves Esau, and he also loves the food. And that's the point. Perhaps he loves the food because he loves his son. As Hoover notes, Isaac declares his love not for Esau, but for the delicacies which Esau is to make, and many scholars have criticized Isaac as preferring the food to his son, but we do not have to draw that conclusion at all. It might well be that the reason he likes this food is because the son he loves makes it. It has nothing to do with his having meat in his mouth or all kinds of things that make him sound like a savage, but simply whatever the food was or whatever the gift of any skill was that his beloved son could offer him, that's what he wants in exchange for the blessing, as a reminder of what he loves in particular about this son. So to extrapolate from this that Isaac is, some kind of, a horrific meat, guzzling monster here, which is, nobody would say it quite that way, rather just someone who likes what his son brings, and you can decide how you hear it. So bring it to me to eat, so that I may bless you before I die. And the I here is nephesh. As Westerman noted half a century ago, for the subject who blesses means the whole person, and could be translated here, so that my life may bless you, which is interesting because sometimes nephesh gets translated as soul, because it's translated in the Septuagint as pasuke, which gets translated as soul because of its use in Greek writing. But plainly, pasuke implies nephesh here, which the literal meaning of is something that breathes, or the act of breathing. As Sarna suggests, Isaac summons from the very depths of his own, and he uses soul, which is unusual for a Jewish commentator, all the vitality and energy at his command in order to evoke God's blessing upon his son. Hoover notes the alternative meaning of nephesh as appetite, or in my research suggesting the seat of appetite. Not the appetite itself, but the place from which appetites arise, and that would also connect it with the food. And we see, I've translated here as nephesh because we'll see it a number of times here, both in the mouth of Jacob here and in the mouth down here of Esau. So that I may bless you before I die. And as Westerman notes down here, it is the vitality that is passed on by the one who is departing from life to the one who is continuing in life. In this process, no distinction is made between the corporal and the spiritual, and so both action and word are required. Because the blessing is concerned with vitality as a whole, the blessing cannot return or be subsequently altered. Whether that following conclusion is valid or not, we'll have to see as we go. But the point that Westerman's making is a good one, is that this is not a, quote, spiritual blessing versus a corporeal blessing. For the mentality of the authors who wrote these stories, a person is a unified whole with God's Spirit in them, making them alive, making them a nephesh like all the other living, breathing beings, and that's what's being blessed. So as we can see, Rebecca was listening, and we'll look next time to what Rebecca's plan is, if it's different than Isaac's plan. See you for that next time.